The distress beacon had been sending its desperate cry into the void of space for 3 standard cycles. Commander Eth stood on the bridge of his science vessel, the Gentle Dawn, watching the enemy ship circle his position like predators waiting for their prey to tire. His 4 thin arms trembled as he gripped the console in front of him. His large silver eyes reflected the harsh light of the warships that had surrounded his vessel. They were not built for conflict. They had evolved on a paradise world where the gravity was gentle and the weather was kind. Their bodies were slender and fragile, with bones that could snap under pressure that other species would consider mild. They were scientists and artists and philosophers. They had no weapons on their ship because they had never needed them. The Galactic Coalition had always protected the peaceful races from harm. But the Coalition was far away, and they were here. Eth turned to his science officer, a young named N whose pale blue skin had gone almost white with fear. The rest of the crew, 45 souls who had signed up for a simple research mission to study cosmic radiation patterns, huddled at their stations. Some were quietly weeping. Others had gone still, their minds retreating from the horror of what was about to happen. Everyone in the galaxy knew what they did to captured ships. The reptilian raiders had built an empire on slavery and suffering. They took prisoners from weaker species and sold them to the highest bidder. Though with their delicate frames and obedient natures, were considered premium merchandise in the darker corners of the universe. "Commander," N whispered, "they are hailing us again. They demand we lower our shields and prepare for boarding." Eth closed his eyes. He thought of his family back home, his partner and their 3 young ones who would never know what happened to him. He thought of his crew, innocent researchers who had trusted him to keep them safe. He had failed them all. But there was one last thing he could try. "Open a channel to the Coalition emergency frequency," he ordered. "Maximum power. Scatter the signal through every relay we can reach." N hesitated. "Commander, the nearest Coalition patrol is at least 12 cycles away. They cannot possibly arrive in time." "I know," Eth replied. "But someone might hear us, someone might come, we have to try." He stepped forward and began to speak into the communication array, his voice carrying all the desperation and fear he felt. He described their position, their attackers, the number of souls aboard his ship. He begged for any vessel within range to respond. He promised whatever payment or favor his government could provide. He pleaded for mercy from an uncaring universe. The signal burst out into space, bouncing off relay stations and slipping through subspace channels. Most of it traveled along the expected paths, heading toward Coalition space where it would arrive far too late to matter. But a small fragment of the signal found something unexpected. A newly formed wormhole, unstable and uncharted, caught the transmission and flung it across the galaxy in the space of a heartbeat. The signal emerged in a sector of space that the Coalition had marked with red warning symbols and dire cautions. The databases called it territory, and all Coalition vessels were forbidden from entering without special clearance and heavy escort. The humans who lived there had no idea they were considered dangerous. They simply called it home. Morgan was halfway through her night shift on the communication deck of the United Earth ship Resolute when the signal cut through her routine monitoring. She was a young woman with brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. The transmission was garbled and broken, run through translation software that struggled to make sense of an alien language, but the meaning was clear enough. Someone was in trouble, someone was scared, someone was about to be taken by slavers. Felt her stomach tighten. She had joined the Earth Defense Fleet because she wanted to explore the stars and meet new civilizations. She had not expected to hear someone begging for their life on a random Tuesday night. "Computer, clean up this signal and trace its origin," she commanded. The ship's systems went to work, filtering out the static and calculating the trajectory of the transmission. When the results appeared on her screen, frowned. The signal had come from far outside known human space, from a region they had never explored. The species identification came back as unknown. The attackers were listed in their limited database as with a note that read simply, "Dangerous, hostile, avoid contact." Made her decision. She reached for the internal communication switch and spoke the words that would change the course of galactic history. "Captain to the bridge, we have an emergency transmission. Unknown species under attack by hostile forces. Request immediate response." Captain Daniel had been sleeping in his quarters when the call came. He was a tall man in his early 40s with a strong build, dark skin, and calm brown eyes that had seen too much to be easily disturbed. He had commanded the Resolute for 6 years, guiding his crew through asteroid fields and solar storms and the occasional pirate attack. He trusted his people, and when Morgan said something was an emergency, he believed her. He arrived on the bridge 4 minutes later, still pulling on his uniform jacket, played the transmission for him without a word. The alien voice, filled with terror and desperation, echoed through the command center. The bridge crew, those who were on duty during the night cycle, stopped what they were doing to listen. When the message ended, there was silence. "How far?" Daniel asked. 6 hours at maximum burn, sir," replied. "It is outside our patrol zone, outside Coalition space entirely according to the star charts." "Do we have any information on the species sending the distress call?" "Negative, Captain. They are not in our database, but the who are attacking them are listed as known slavers operating in the Outer Rim territories." Daniel stood still for a long moment, considering. They had no treaty with this unknown species. They had no obligation to respond. They would be burning fuel and risking their ship to help complete strangers who might not even be grateful for the intervention. Every practical consideration said they should log the transmission, forward it to command, and continue their patrol. But Daniel had not joined the fleet to be practical. "Set course," he ordered, "maximum speed, and wake the Marines. Tell Lieutenant Cole to have his team ready for a combat boarding action." The bridge crew sprang into motion, felt a smile tugging at her lips as she input the new coordinates. Whatever they found out there, wherever this signal had come from, they were going to answer it. That was what humans did. That was named, and he had been raiding ships across the Outer Rim for nearly 30 years. He was massive even by the standards of his species, standing nearly 3 meters tall with scales the color of dried blood and eyes like chips of yellow ice. His claws had torn through the hulls of countless vessels, and his name was spoken with fear on 100 different worlds. He watched the science ship with the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. His fleet of 8 warships surrounded the tiny vessel like wolves circling a wounded deer. There was no rush. They had no weapons, no fighters, no way to escape. Could take his time and enjoy the anticipation. "Prepare the boarding crews," he ordered his second-in-command, a female named. "I want the cargo sorted by value before we leave this sector. The young ones go in separate containers. They sell for more when they have not been damaged." Nodded and turned to relay the orders, but before she could speak, the sensor officer let out a sharp hiss of confusion. "I am detecting an unknown vessel approaching at high speed. Its engine signature does not match anything in our database." Frowned. This sector was far from the main shipping lanes, and the Coalition had no patrols in the area. He had chosen this hunting ground precisely because it was empty and forgotten. "Show me," he demanded. The main flickered and displayed the approaching ship. It was smaller than his flagship, but built in a way that made no sense to his tactical mind. The hull was thick and dense, reinforced with layers of metal that seemed excessive for any practical purpose. The engine output was enormous, far more powerful than a ship that size should need. "Hail them," ordered. "Find out who dares to interrupt our work." The response came moments later, transmitted in a language that the universal translator struggled to process. When the words finally resolved into something understandable, they were spoken by a calm male voice that carried no trace of fear. This is Captain Daniel of the United Earth ship Resolute. You will power down your weapons and release the vessel you have surrounded. You have 60 seconds to comply. Stared at the screen in disbelief. He had never heard of Earth or its people. No species in the known galaxy would be foolish enough to threaten a war fleet with a single ship. This had to be some kind of mistake or perhaps a very poor joke. Human, he replied, tasting the unfamiliar word. You are either very brave or very stupid. This prize belongs to the Dominion. Leave now, and I will allow you to keep your life. The human captain's response was immediate. I do not think you understand the situation. Those people called for help. We are here to provide it. You can surrender peacefully, or we can do this the hard way. The choice is yours, but I would recommend the first option. Felt a growl building in his throat. He had crushed rebellions and burned colonies. He had faced coalition warships and sent them fleeing into the void. No creature spoke to him with such casual disrespect. All ships, he snarled, attack formation. Destroy that vessel and bring me its captain. I want to eat his heart while it still beats. The fleet moved with practiced precision, 8 warships spreading out to encircle the lone human vessel. Their weapons charged with deadly energy, targeting systems locking onto the approaching ship. Leaned forward in his command chair, eager to watch this arrogant stranger burn. The Resolute dropped out of faster-than-light travel and into normal space like a stone falling into still water. For a moment, the sensors went wild, struggling to make sense of what they were seeing. The human ship was far denser than anything they had encountered before, its mass readings suggesting construction materials that they had never even heard of. Open fire, commanded. 8 ships unleashed their weapons at once. Plasma bolts and kinetic rounds streaked across the void toward the human vessel. The barrage was enough to crack open a coalition cruiser or shatter a space station. It struck the Resolute dead center. And it did nothing. The human ship shrugged off the attack like a large animal ignoring the bites of insects. Its shields flickered briefly, absorbing the energy, and then it continued forward without slowing. On the Resolute's bridge, Captain watched the damage report scroll across his screen and felt a grim satisfaction. Return fire, he ordered quietly. Disable their engines. I want them alive to face justice, but I want them going nowhere. The Resolute's weapons were not elegant or sophisticated. Humans had never developed the graceful energy weapons that other species preferred. Instead, they had taken their natural talent for destruction and refined it into something brutally effective. The ship's main guns fired projectiles accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, kinetic rounds that struck with the force of small nuclear explosions. The first warship lost its engines in a single shot. The second had its weapons array torn away before it could fire again. The third tried to flee and found its navigation systems reduced to molten slag. Watched in horror as his fleet was systematically dismantled by a single vessel that should not have existed. The human ship moved through his formation like a predator among prey, striking with precision and withdrawing before his gunners could track it. His warriors were screaming, his officers were panicking, and for the first time in 30 years, they felt the cold touch of fear. "What are these creatures?" gasped, her scales pale with shock. "What world could possibly produce something like this?" Had no answer. His database had no record of Earth or its inhabitants, but somewhere deep in his predator brain, an ancient instinct was screaming at him to run, to flee, to escape before it was too late. He ignored it. He did not retreat. "All ships concentrate fire on that vessel," he roared. "Every gun, every missile, everything we have." The remaining ships turned their combined firepower on the Resolute. For a few seconds, the human ship was engulfed in explosions and energy discharges that lit up the darkness of space like a small sun. When the barrage finally ended, held his breath, waiting for the debris field that would mark his enemy's destruction. The Resolute emerged from the fire undamaged. On its bridge, Daniel sighed and shook his head. He had hoped they would see reason, but it seemed they needed a more direct lesson. "All right," he said to his weapons officer, "take out their flagship's engines and prepare the boarding parties. We are going to finish this up close." In the Marine Bay, Lieutenant Cole checked his weapon one final time and smiled. It was time to go to work. Lieutenant Cole had been a Marine for 12 years. He was a compact man with broad shoulders and arms thick with muscle, his brown hair cut short and his jaw set in a permanent expression of calm readiness. He had fought pirates in the asteroid belts, rescued colonists from natural disasters, and trained for situations exactly like this one. His squad was the best on the Resolute. Sergeant Lisa Tanner stood at his right side, a tall woman with red hair and pale skin dotted with freckles. She carried a medical kit alongside her weapon because she believed in fixing things as much as breaking them. Behind them stood 10 more Marines, men and women who had volunteered to put their lives on the line for strangers they had never met. The boarding pod launched from the Resolute with a violent shudder, felt the acceleration press him back into his seat as the small craft hurtled across the void toward the science vessel. Sensors showed boarding parties already attached to the hull, their raiders preparing to cut through and claim their prizes. "Not today." "Listen up," said through the squad channel. "Primary objective is to secure the crew and eliminate any hostile forces on board. These are slavers. They have done this to countless innocent people across the galaxy. Today we show them what happens when they pick the wrong fight." The pod slammed into the hull and locked on with magnetic clamps. The cutting torch blazed to life, slicing through the alien metal in seconds. Was the first through the breach, his boots hitting the deck in the low gravity that the preferred. His armor automatically adjusted, keeping him stable as he swept the corridor with his weapon. The first raider appeared around a corner, drawn by the sound of the breach. It was a huge creature, nearly a meter taller than, with scales that gleamed under the emergency lighting and claws that looked capable of tearing through steel. It let out a roar and charged, clearly expecting the smaller being in its path to flee or freeze. Stood his ground. He had learned about the during the approach, studying what little information their database contained. They were large and intimidating, yes, but they had evolved on a world with gravity far lighter than Earth. Their impressive muscles had developed to move their bodies in an environment where weight was almost meaningless. They had never needed true strength. Humans were different. Earth was a heavy world, a planet that tried to crush everything that lived on its surface from the moment of birth. Human muscles and bones had evolved to fight against that constant pull, to carry their weight through atmospheres thick enough to kill most other species. What looked like an ordinary human body contained strength that they could not begin to imagine. The raider's claws struck armored forearm with enough force to dent steel. The human did not move. His yellow eyes widened in confusion, processing the impossible fact that this small creature had just absorbed an attack that should have sent it flying across the corridor. His counterattack was not flashy or complicated. He simply punched thee in the chest. The raider flew backward, its body crumpling around the point of impact. The sound of breaking bones echoed through the corridor as the creature hit the far wall and slid to the ground, unmoving, stepped over it without a second glance. "Move up," he ordered. 2 by 2, check every compartment. Tanner, take your team to engineering and secure the power systems. I do not want anyone getting any clever ideas about self-destruction." Lisa nodded and peeled off with her squad, disappearing down a side passage. Continued forward, his team spreading out behind him in a pattern they had practiced 1,000 times. The boarding party had clearly not expected resistance. They had come prepared to terrify helpless scientists, not to fight an enemy that refused to be afraid. Marines swept through the ship with brutal efficiency, overwhelming the raiders before they could organize a defense. In one compartment, found 3 raiders cornering a group of. The delicate aliens were huddled together, their thin limbs trembling and their large eyes reflecting the terror they felt. They were laughing, enjoying the fear they inspired, reaching for their prizes with greedy claws. The laughter stopped when entered the room. "Step away from them," he said, his voice calm and level despite the anger burning in his chest. "This is your only warning." The lead raider turned and sneered at him. "One human against three, you are either brave or stupid. Either way, you will make a fine slave once we break your spirit." Tilted his head slightly, I said step away. They attacked together, clearly believing that numbers would make the difference. They were wrong, moved through them like water through sand, redirecting their strikes and returning blows that shattered bones and ruptured organs. In less than 10 seconds, all three raiders were on the ground and had not taken a single hit. He turned to the who were staring at him with expressions that mixed terror and awe in equal measure. He tried to make his voice gentle, remembering that these beings had just witnessed something that probably looked like a nightmare to them. "It is okay," he said softly. "We are here to help. Is anyone hurt?" Outside the vessel, the battle was ending. Captain had disabled the flagship and was methodically destroying the weapons systems of the remaining raiders. He did not want to kill them if he could avoid it. Humans had long memories, and he knew that every dead enemy created new enemies from those left behind. But he would not let them escape either. These had come to take innocent people and sell them into slavery. They would face justice for their crimes, whether that justice came from a coalition court or from themselves. "Captain," called from her station, "Lieutenant Cole reports the vessel is secure. All hostile forces have been neutralized or captured. The crew is frightened but unharmed." Daniel nodded, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. "Tell him well done, and ask the commander if he would be willing to meet with me. I think we have some explaining to do." He looked out at the drifting ships, their weapons silent and their engines dead. Somewhere out there, a named was probably plotting revenge. Daniel did not particularly care. The humans had come to help and they had helped. That was enough. He just hoped they would understand. Commander Eth had spent the entire battle hiding in the deepest compartment of his ship, surrounded by his crew and praying to whatever gods might be listening. The sounds that reached them through the walls had been terrifying. Weapons fire and screaming, and the heavy impacts of bodies hitting metal. He had been certain that they had won, and that his people were simply waiting their turn to be dragged out and sorted for sale. When the sounds finally stopped, he held his breath. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then came a knock at the sealed door, gentle and almost polite, followed by a voice that the translator rendered in a calm, friendly tone. "This is Lieutenant Cole of the United Earth ship Resolute. The hostile forces have been neutralized. You are safe now. May we enter?" Eth exchanged looks with his crew. No one spoke. They had never heard of Earth or its ship. They had no idea what species was on the other side of that door or what they might want. The only thing they knew for certain was that these beings had just defeated a war party in minutes, something that should have been impossible. "Commander," In whispered, "perhaps we should comply. They do not sound hostile." Eth considered his options. They could refuse to open the door, but that would only delay the inevitable. If these unknown creatures wanted to enter, a simple lock would not stop beings who had just torn through raiders like they were nothing. At least if he cooperated, there was a chance they might show mercy. He reached out with a trembling hand and authorized the door to open. The creatures that entered were the most terrifying things Ed had ever seen. They moved with a fluid grace that spoke of predatory instincts, their bodies compact and dense with muscle. Their eyes faced forward like hunters, designed to track prey rather than watch for threats from the sides. Their skin came in various shades of brown and pink, stretched over frames that radiated controlled power. One of them, a male with short brown hair and a jaw that looked capable of crushing bone, stepped forward and held up his hands in what seemed to be a gesture of peace. His voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly soft. "My name is. We received your distress signal and came to help. No one is going to hurt you now." Eth wanted to believe him. Everything about his tone suggested honesty and kindness. But the instincts were screaming at them to flee, to hide, to get as far away from these predators as possible. This was a being from one of those nightmare planets that the Coalition warned everyone to avoid. Behind, another human removed her helmet. She was tall for her species, with hair the color of fire and pale skin dotted with small marks. Her teeth, when she smiled, were blunt but clearly designed for tearing food apart. She should have looked terrifying. Instead, she looked kind. "Hi there," Lisa Tanner said gently. "I know we probably look scary to you. We get that a lot. But I promise we are here to help. Is anyone injured? I have medical training and supplies." One of the younger, a female named Crystalline Note who had joined the expedition to study stellar phenomena, let out a soft cry and collapsed. The stress had been too much for her fragile cardiovascular system. Her body simply gave out, unable to handle the terror she had experienced. Lisa was at her side before anyone could react. She dropped to her knees beside the fallen, pulling equipment from her pack with hands that moved with practiced speed. Her expression was focused but gentle as she scanned the alien body with a medical device and began working to stabilize her. "Stay with me, sweetheart," Lisa murmured, her voice impossibly soft for a creature that had been breaking bones just minutes earlier. "You are going to be okay. Just keep breathing. Tell the ship we need their medical officer over here. This one is going into shock." Nodded and spoke quietly into his communication device. Eth watched in stunned silence as the human woman worked to save a member of his crew. Her movements were gentle and precise, her attention completely focused on the unconscious. She did not ask for payment or favors. She did not demand information or submission. She simply worked, pouring her skill and energy into keeping a stranger alive. The Resolute's medical officer arrived minutes later, another human named Grant who carried more advanced equipment. He and Lisa worked together over Crystalline Note while the rest of the crew watched in disbelief. These beings from a nightmare planet, were treating their injured with more care than most physicians Eth had known. "She is stable," announced after what felt like an eternity. "Her heart is functioning normally again. She will need rest and observation, but I believe she will make a full recovery." Eth felt tears forming in his large silver eyes. He had been prepared to watch his crew be taken as slaves. He had been ready to spend the rest of his short life in captivity, broken and humiliated. Instead, a ship full of had appeared out of nowhere, destroyed his enemies, and saved his people. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you come? Why did you help us? You do not know us, you owe us nothing." Turned to face him, his expression thoughtful. "We heard your call for help, that was enough. But we are strangers. We are not even from your region of space. Surely you had better things to do than risk your lives for beings you had never met." The human smiled, and despite everything Ev's instincts were telling him, it looked warm and genuine. "Where we come from, helping people in trouble is just what you do. It does not matter if they are friends or strangers. If someone needs help and you can provide it, you help them. Simple as that." Eth stared at him, trying to process this information. The Coalition database described as violent and unpredictable, dangerous creatures from dangerous worlds who could not be trusted. Nothing in those files had mentioned that they might also be compassionate, that they might cross the galaxy to save people they had never met simply because it was the right thing to do. He looked at Lisa, still monitoring Crystalline Note with careful attention. He looked at, packing away his medical equipment with practiced efficiency. He looked at the other Marines, standing guard at the door with weapons ready but bodies relaxed, clearly posing no threat to anyone who did not threaten them first. Perhaps the databases were wrong about a great many things. The journey to Coalition space took 3 weeks. The vessel, its engines damaged during the initial attack, traveled slowly under its own power while the Resolute kept pace alongside. The captured raiders followed behind, their ships locked in tow fields that prevented any escape attempts. During those weeks, something remarkable happened. The who had started the journey terrified of their rescuers slowly began to understand the truth about humans. They watched them laugh and joke with each other, sharing meals in the galley and playing games during their off hours. They saw the humans treat their own injured with the same gentleness they had shown to Crystalline Note. They listened to stories about a planet called Earth, a world of crushing gravity and savage weather and predators lurking in every shadow. And they began to realize that everything they had been taught about was wrong. Commander Eth spent hours in conversation with Captain Daniel, learning about human history and culture. The stories were both wonderful and horrifying. Humans had spent most of their existence fighting each other, waging wars over territory and resources and ideas. They had nearly destroyed their own planet multiple times before finally learning to work together. But they had also created incredible art and music and literature. They had developed philosophies of peace and justice that guided their behavior even when violence would have been easier. They had looked up at the stars and dreamed of a future where all species could live together in harmony. "We are not perfect," Daniel admitted during one late-night conversation. "We have made terrible mistakes throughout our history, but we keep trying to be better. We keep reaching for something greater than ourselves. I think that is what makes us human." Eth nodded slowly. "The Coalition teaches us that are dangerous, that they cannot be trusted. They say your kind only understands violence." "Violence is something we understand, yes," Daniel replied. "We evolved on a world where everything tried to kill us from the moment we were born. Fighting back was how we survived. But violence is a tool, not a purpose. We use it when we have to protect ourselves and others. We do not use it because we enjoy it." They seemed to enjoy it. Daniel's expression darkened. "They are predators who prey on the weak. They take pleasure in the suffering of others. We are not like them. When we fight, it is to stop people like them from hurting innocents. There is no joy in it, only necessity." When the convoy finally reached Coalition space, word of what had happened spread rapidly through the communication networks. A new species had emerged from the restricted sectors, who answered distress calls meant for others. The story grew with each retelling, details added and embellished until the humans sounded less like real beings and more like legends. The Coalition Council demanded a formal hearing. Commander Eth was required to testify about his experience, to describe what he had witnessed and explain his interactions with the humans. He stood before the assembled representatives of 100 different worlds and spoke the truth. "I expected monsters," he began, his voice carrying through the great chamber. "Our databases described as violent and uncontrollable, dangerous creatures from dangerous worlds. When the human ship arrived, I was certain we had simply traded one enemy for another." The council members leaned forward, listening intently. "I watched a single human soldier defeat 3 raiders in hand-to-hand combat. I saw their ship absorb firepower that would have destroyed any vessel in our fleet. By every measure, these beings are exactly as dangerous as our files suggest, perhaps more dangerous than we ever imagined." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several representatives cast nervous glances toward the back of the room, where Captain stood with a small delegation of his crew. "But I also watched a human woman spend 6 hours keeping my researcher alive when our own medical technology had failed," Eth continued. "I saw their captain refuse to destroy fleeing enemies when he could have killed them all. I heard their soldiers laugh and joke with my crew, teaching us games from there, sharing stories of their families." He paused, gathering himself for what he wanted to say next. "The humans call Earth a paradise. They love their deadly world with a fierceness I cannot comprehend, and they extend that same fierce love to strangers. They protected us not because we could offer them anything, not because we had any strategic value, but simply because they heard our cry for help and could not bear to ignore it. Eth turned to face the human delegation. Captain met his gaze steadily, his expression calm and open. The distress signal was meant for our allies, Eth concluded, but answered it, and I believe, honored counsel, that we have found friends far more valuable than any ally we ever expected. The debate that followed lasted for days. Some representatives argued that the humans were too dangerous to allow into coalition space. Others pointed out that the same dangerous qualities had saved 47 innocent lives. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Earth would be invited to send a diplomatic delegation. The humans would be welcomed as provisional members of the galactic community, subject to certain restrictions and observations. It was not full acceptance, but it was a beginning. 6 months later, Morgan stood on the observation deck of the Resolute and watched the first transport ship approach Earth orbit. It carried gifts of advanced technology and offers of friendship from a species that had once thought of humans as monsters. In return, the human delegation had prepared some gifts of their own. "What exactly did we promise to teach them?" asked Daniel, joining her at the window. Smiled. Commander Eth mentioned that his people had never tasted chocolate before. I figured it would be a nice icebreaker. Daniel laughed. "Well, that should earn us some goodwill, anything else." They apparently find the concept of pets fascinating. They have never kept other creatures for companionship before. I think we are going to show them some videos of dogs. Outside, the stars glittered against the eternal darkness. Somewhere out there, they were plotting their revenge. Somewhere out there, other species were hearing stories about the who answered distress calls and wondering what it meant. The galaxy was vast and full of dangers, and humanity was just beginning to find its place among the stars. But for now, at this moment, there was peace. There was friendship growing between beings who had never expected to find common ground. There was hope that perhaps the universe was not as cold and uncaring as it sometimes seemed. The humans had come to help. That was what they did. And maybe, just maybe, that was going to change everything.